What would you do if the army itself had spent 17 years searching for 6 wagons of ordnance and gold payroll that vanished crossing 40 miles of open salt flat and never found so much as a wheel rim? Clara Whitfield was 19 years old, and she had $11 and a dead man's brass belt buckle when she rode out alone into that same country, because nobody left in the world would give her a reason to stay behind. But what she found out there past the third dry lake bed, sitting exactly where the map said nothing could sit, would turn a forgotten disaster into a debt that half a county still owed. Settle in with us for this one. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from tonight, and stay close, because the flats keep their secrets slowly, and so will we. Clara Whitfield had been born in a freighter's camp on the Cimarron Cutoff, the only child of a teamster named Walter Whitfield and a laundress named Dina, who had married each other in a tent chapel with 2 witnesses borrowed from a passing wagon train, and never regretted it for a single one of the 14 years they had together. Dinah died of a lung fever the winter Clara was 9, coughing quietly into a folded cloth in the back of a freight wagon somewhere between 2 towns neither of them had a name for yet. And after that it was only Walter and Clara and the long roads of the territory, moving supply between forts and mining camps and railheads, sleeping under the wagon more nights than not. Walter Whitfield was not a sentimental man, but he loved his daughter in the plain, practical way of a man who has nothing else left to spend his love on. And he taught her everything a freighter's daughter needed to know to survive the roads he could not always protect her from. He taught her to read a brand and a manifest. He taught her to splice a hame strap and grease an axle in under 10 minutes with her eyes half shut in the dark. He taught her to count a payroll twice before she signed for it, and to trust no man's arithmetic but her own. And he told her, more than once, sitting by a low fire with his boots off and his pipe unlit, because tobacco was a luxury they could rarely spare, that he had once driven for the army, back before Clara was born, hauling ordnance and coin out of Fort Laramore toward the mining camps in the western hills. He would not say much more than that. He would only take out, on certain quiet nights, a brass belt buckle stamped with crossed rifles and the number 6, and turn it over in his big scarred hands, and say that he had carried it since the worst week of his life, and that someday, if she ever needed to understand a thing about him she could not otherwise understand, the buckle would tell her where to look. The mentor who filled the gap Dinah's death had left was a freight master named Obadiah Kest, 61 years old, a heavyset, silent man who ran the wagon yard at Laramore Crossing and had known Walter Whitfield since before either of them had gray in their beards. Obadiah had lost a wife to cholera and 2 sons to a war Clara had only ever heard referenced in the flattest possible terms. And he kept his grief the way he kept his ledgers, in careful columns nobody else was permitted to read. When Walter was on the road for weeks at a stretch, Clara stayed in Obadiah's yard, and he taught her to shoe a mule and to read a sky for the kind of heat that could kill a team by midday, and to keep her own counsel in a business built on other people's talk. He was not affectionate. He never once told her she had done well, but he kept a stool for her by his stove every evening she was under his roof, and he taught her to play a slow, patient game of dominoes that neither of them ever seemed in a hurry to finish, and once, when she was 14 and had just talked a supplier down $2 a barrel on flour, he had set down his pipe and said only, "Your father would say that was well done," which from Obadiah Kest was very nearly a parade. Walter Whitfield died in the spring. Clara turned 19, thrown from a wagon box on a bad grade above Sender's Pass when the brake chain gave way, and he lingered 3 days in a bed at the mission house before the injury took him. Clara sat with him the whole of it. On the second night, when the fever had him talking loosely, he gripped her wrist with more strength than she thought he had left, and told her, in pieces that did not entirely hang together, that the buckle was not a keepsake, that he had not lost it in the ordinary way a man loses things, that there had been 6 wagons and 6 drivers out on the Coldwater Flats in the autumn of '78, and that he had been the only one who walked back in. He said a name, Colonel Aldous Pratt, twice, with something in his voice that was not grief and was not fear, but sat somewhere close to both. And then the fever broke for a few hours, and he slept, and in the morning he did not speak of it again, and 3 days later he was gone, and Clara Whitfield understood that whatever he had meant to tell her, he had run out of road before he could finish. There was no money. There was no house, because they had never owned one. There was a wagon and a team that belonged half to Obadiah Kest under an old partnership, and Obadiah, gently but plainly, told her the team would need to be sold to settle what her father owed the yard in feed and repairs across the last hard winter. She did not argue. She understood the arithmetic of freighting well enough to know he was not cheating her. What she kept, when the last of it was settled, was a canvas grip with 2 changes of clothes, her mother's small tin of sewing needles, and the brass belt buckle stamped with crossed rifles and the number 6 on a leather thong she wore under her shirt against her collarbone, where she could feel its weight when she breathed. In her coat lining, sewn in by her own hand the night before she left Larimore Crossing, she carried $11, which was every cent that remained to her in the world once her father's small debts were paid. Obadiah offered her a place in his yard, cooking and keeping his books, and she knew it was offered out of real kindness and not obligation, and she was grateful for it in a way she did not have words for at 19. But she had turned the buckle over in her hands every night since her father's death, and she had heard the name Pratt again. Once, from a drover passing through the yard, who mentioned it the way men mention old scandal, half amused and half uneasy. Something about ordnance gone missing on the Coldwater Flats near 20 years back. An inquiry that had gone nowhere. An officer who had come out of the affair richer than a man of his rank had any right to be. Clara asked no questions that night. She only listened, and counted the coincidence, and understood that her father had died with a debt unpaid that was not a debt of money, and that she was the only person left alive who might still be able to pay it. She left Larimore Crossing on foot in the first week of April, with a note of thanks to Obadiah folded under his dominoes box, and a ride offered by a mule skinner named Curtis Dell as far as the rail spur at Broken Water, which was as close as any freight road came to the edge of the Coldwater country. Broken Water was not much of a town, a land office, a saloon with a bowed porch, a livery, and a scatter of houses strung along a single dusty street, with the flats themselves visible as a pale shimmer at the southern edge of everything. Flat and white and empty clear to a horizon that did not seem to end. At the land office, a narrow clerk named Simeon Roth looked over his spectacles at her and asked her business, and when she told him she wished to file a claim on any parcel touching the Coldwater Flats, he set down his pen entirely and studied her for a long moment, the way a man studies a horse he suspects of being lame. There was land out there, he said slowly, plenty of it, unclaimed for the very good reason that nothing grew on it, and nothing lived on it, and no one had made $1 off an acre of it in the memory of anyone in Broken Water. There was, he added, a filing fee of $11 for a section that touched the old Convoy road, on account of the county having to survey the boundary against a right-of-way nobody had used in 17 years. 2 men loitering by the stove laughed outright at that, one of them loud enough that his coffee slopped over his cup, and the other called out that she'd have better luck buying a piece of the moon, and at least the moon didn't have Aldous Pratt's boy still riding fence over it. Clara asked, as evenly as she could manage, who Aldous Pratt's boy was. The clerk, Simeon Roth, glanced toward the men by the stove before answering, and said only that Colonel Pratt had died some years back, a respected man, and that his son Garrett Pratt ran cattle on the range abutting the flats and did not care for strangers poking around out there, and that most folks in Broken Water found it easier to let sleeping dogs lie than to ask why a man with no history of prospecting kept two riders permanently posted along a boundary that led to nothing but salt and heat. Clara laid her $11 on the counter, one worn bill and the rest in coin, and signed her name, Clara Whitfield, in a hand steadier than she felt. The men by the stove laughed again as she walked out, and one of them called after her that the flats would have her crying for her mama inside a week. And Clara did not turn around, because turning around had never once in her life made a cruel man kinder. She bought what she could afford at the mercantile, with the last of her traveling money earned doing mending along the road. A canteen, a knife, a length of rope, a small sack of cornmeal and a smaller one of salt, and she walked out of Broken Water in the late afternoon, with the sun already leaning west and the flats opening ahead of her like a held breath. The ground changed underfoot within the first mile, grass giving way to hardpan giving way to a pale crust that crunched and gave slightly under her boots the way old snow does. And the air itself seemed to thin and brighten until the whole world was the color of bone. She walked until the light began to fail and made a cold camp in the lee of a low outcrop of dark rock, the only rise in an otherwise perfectly flat country, and she ate a handful of raw cornmeal mixed with water because she had not yet dared to risk a fire, and she lay on her back with the buckle's weight against her collarbone and looked up at more stars than she had ever seen gathered in one sky. It was there, in the last hour before she meant to sleep, that the old man found her. She never learned his name. He came out of the dark from the direction of the flats themselves, walking without a horse, an old man in a long duster, gone the color of the salt itself, with a face so weathered it seemed carved rather than aged, and he stopped a respectful distance from her fire ring and did not ask permission before he spoke. He said that the flats did not lose things, they only kept them, and that a person who went looking for what the flats were keeping had better be prepared to be kept in turn. Clara asked him what he meant. He said only, 6 wagons went out sealed, and sealed is how the ground likes to find them. And then he turned and walked back into the dark the way he had come. And though she called after him twice, no answer came back but the wind moving over the crust of the flat. She did not sleep well that first night, and she woke before first light with the cold still deep in her bones and the old man's words turning over and over in her mind. She struck camp before sunrise and walked on, keeping the low rock outcrop at her back as a bearing point the way her father had taught her to keep a landmark, and by mid-morning the character of the ground had begun to change again, the hardpan buckling into low shallow depressions where old floodwater had once stood. And it was in the third of these depressions, 40 yards across and rimmed with a crust of white alkali, that she saw the first dark shape breaking the flat white horizon. It was a wagon wheel, standing upright, half sunk in crusted salt, its iron tire scaled with rust, but its spokes still sound. Clara stopped walking entirely and simply looked at it for a long moment, and then she went forward slowly. And past the wheel she began to make out the low, sun-bleached shapes of the wagons themselves, 6 of them, sitting in a loose line as though they had simply been parked there and abandoned mid-journey. Their canvas tops long since rotted to gray tatters where they had not fallen away entirely. Their wooden bodies scoured pale by 17 years of blown salt and sun, but standing square and true on wheels that had somehow never sunk past their rims into the crust beneath them. She counted them twice to be certain her eyes were not deceiving her in the shimmering heat. 6 wagons, exactly as her father had said, sitting in the middle of 40 miles of nothing, in ground so flat and so open that any search party with eyes could have found them within a day of looking. And yet no one, in 17 years, ever had. She approached the nearest wagon with her heart going hard against her ribs. Its tailboard was latched with an iron pin gone orange with rust, and across the latch someone had run a heavy chain and a padlock, and the padlock, when she touched it, was intact, unbroken, exactly as it must have been sealed the day the convoy left Fort Laramore. She walked the length of the line. Every wagon bore the same seal, the same untouched chain, the same crossed rifles stamped into the lockplate that matched the buckle against her collarbone exactly. Nothing had been looted. Nothing had been opened. 6 wagons of Army ordnance and payroll had sat in open country for 17 years, visible to any rider who cared to cross the flats, and every seal on every wagon remained unbroken, which meant either that no one in 17 years had found them, or that someone had found them long ago and chosen, for reasons of his own, to leave them exactly as they stood, and to make very sure no one else ever wandered close enough to ask why. Clara did not open a single wagon that first day. She had learned from her father that a thing worth understanding was not worth rushing, and she set her canteen and her small store of food in the shade of the nearest wagon bed, and began instead to walk the whole of the little camp the convoy had made, looking without touching. She found, 40 yards south of the wagon line, a shallow depression in the crust that might once have been a cook fire. She found, near the 3rd wagon, a rusted horseshoe half sunk in the salt, and near the 5th, a scrap of leather harness gone stiff as wood. And cut into the tailboard of the lead wagon, low near the iron hinge, she found a mark scratched with a knife point, small and deliberate, a number 6 inside a circle, exactly matching the number stamped into her father's buckle. She made her camp that first night inside the shell of the lead wagon itself, sheltered from the wind by its high sides, and she did not sleep easily. Twice in the night she woke to a low grinding sound that she told herself was only the old wood settling under the changing cold. Though she could not entirely convince herself of it, and once, near what she judged to be the deepest hour before dawn, she thought she heard, very faint and very far off, the sound of a horse's slow, deliberate walk circling somewhere out beyond the firelight. Though when she sat up and listened, there was nothing but wind. In the days that followed, Clara Whitfield did what her father and Obadiah Kest had both taught her to do with any problem too large to solve all at once, which was to break it into pieces small enough for her 2 hands to manage. She could not yet open the wagons, not without proper tools, and something in her held back from breaking a federal seal without understanding first what she was breaking it for. So she worked instead on making the camp livable, and on looking, patiently, for whatever the ground and the wagons themselves were still willing to tell her. She rigged a shelter from a length of the least rotted canvas, stretched between 2 of the wagons to cut the worst of the wind. She dug, with the small folding shovel she had bought in Broken Water, down through the salt crust near the old cook fire depression, and found, 18 inches down, a scattering of tin cans and the charred remnants of what had once been a mess kit, undisturbed since the day it was left. She found, walking the perimeter of the little camp in ever-widening rings, the way her father had taught her to search unfamiliar ground, a second set of wheel ruts, fainter and older than the convoy's own tracks, curving in from the east and stopping short of the wagons by a distance of some 60 yards, as though a rider or a light wagon had approached, and paused, and turned back without ever closing the last stretch. On the fourth day, working the hardpan near the second wagon with the flat of her shovel, she struck something that gave a hollow, wooden sound entirely unlike the ring of iron or the scrape of stone. She knelt and worked the salt away with her hands, patient the way Obadiah had taught her patience over a slow game of dominoes, and uncovered, buried scarcely a foot beneath the crust, a small strongbox, its lid domed and its corners bound in iron, entirely separate from the 6 wagons, and clearly buried after the fact by someone who had known exactly where to dig. It was not locked. The hasp had been forced once, long ago, and never resealed. Clara sat back on her heels in the white glare of midday and looked at it for a long while before she lifted the lid. Inside, wrapped in oiled cloth gone brittle and pale, she found a leather-bound ledger, its pages foxed but legible, and beneath it a bundle of letters tied with cord, and beneath those, a single folded commission paper bearing the seal of the territorial garrison and the name Colonel Aldous Pratt. Clara opened the ledger first, and her father's own handwriting looked back up at her from the first page, small and careful, a driver's manifest dated October of 1878, listing 6 wagons, 6 drivers, and a cargo of ordnance stores, and a military payroll bound for the mining camps in the western hills. She turned the pages slowly. The entries continued for 11 days of ordinary road, weather, mileage, the ordinary business of a working convoy, and then, on the 12th day, the hand changed, hurried and pressed hard into the paper, and the entry said that Colonel Pratt had ordered the convoy off its charted road and out onto the Coldwater Flats under claim of a shorter route, against the strong objection of every driver present, and that by nightfall 2 wagons had broken axles in the salt crust, and the convoy was stranded with no water within 30 miles in any direction. The next entry, dated 2 days later, was in a different hand entirely, tighter and more careful, and it named itself as belonging to a young lieutenant, Thomas Ashworth, and it stated plainly that Colonel Pratt had ordered the drivers to remain with the wagons while he rode for water and rescue, and that he had taken with him, on his own saddle, a portion of the payroll coin against every article of regulation Ashworth knew, for what the colonel called safekeeping. The entry after that, in her father's hand again, said only that the colonel had not returned in 3 days, that 2 drivers had died of the heat and the lack of water, and that Walter Whitfield himself, against Ashworth's pleading, had set out on foot at night for Fort Laramore to bring help, because someone had to, and that he did not expect to survive the walk, but would rather die trying than sit and watch the rest of the men die waiting. Clara read the final entries with her hands gone unsteady. Walter Whitfield had walked out and survived, barely, found half dead by a line rider 2 days later, and brought in to Laramore Crossing raving of wagons and thirst. By the time a relief party could be organized and sent back out, a dust storm had scoured the flats for 3 days running, and when the party finally reached the last known position, they found nothing. No wagons, no bodies, no trace, because Colonel Aldous Pratt, having returned to the flats with water he never intended to share, and having found half his men already dead of the heat, had made a choice. That the ledger, in Lieutenant Ashworth's final and unfinished entry, called by its plain name, he had let the rest die rather than answer for the missing payroll, and had reported the entire convoy lost to a flash flood that every man who had actually been on the flats that week knew never came. The bundle of letters, when Clara opened them with hands that would not quite stay steady, confirmed what the ledger implied. They were letters from Ashworth's own family, written to the army in the years following, pleading for an honest inquiry into their son's disappearance, and each one bore, in the margin, a small notation in a hand Clara now recognized from the commission paper as Pratt's own. instructions to a subordinate to see that the correspondence was filed and no further action taken. Aldous Pratt had buried the strongbox himself, she understood now, sometime in the weeks after the disaster, likely intending to return for the ledger and the letters once the affair had gone fully cold, and had never come back, whether from guilt or fear or simple cowardice she would never know, and had instead built the rest of his life and his son's inheritance on the foundation of 6 sealed wagons and the silence of the dead. She had scarcely closed the strongbox and covered it again with a fold of canvas when she heard the sound of hooves, unmistakable this time, approaching from the east at a hard trot. Clara stood and turned to find 2 riders reining up at the edge of the old camp, and the lead rider, a broad, sun-reddened man of perhaps 40 in a good hat and a poor temper, sat his horse and looked at her the way a man looks at trespassing livestock. He introduced himself, unnecessarily, as Garrett Pratt, and said that this range and everything on it belonged to his family, that she had no business filing on ground that touched his boundary line, and that she would do well to pack up whatever she thought she'd found and ride back to Broken Water before nightfall. Clara asked him plainly whether he knew what his father had done out on this ground in the autumn of '78. Garrett Pratt's face did something complicated at that, a flicker of a man who has always half known a thing and never let himself finish knowing it. And then he told her, in a voice gone low and hard, that whatever she thought she had found in these wagons belonged to the army and not to her, and that she would be wise to leave it sealed and leave the flats altogether, because the ground out here had a way of keeping people who asked too many questions. It was not quite a threat spoken outright, but Clara understood it as one, and she told him only that she intended to ride for the fort at first light with everything she had found, and that he was welcome to ride with her if he wanted the truth told in his presence rather than behind his back. Garrett Pratt held her eyes a long moment, said nothing further, and turned his horse and rode back east with his silent companion, and Clara stood alone in the white glare of the flats, with her heart going hard and the strongbox at her feet. The storm came that same night, faster than any weather she had ever seen build, a wall of dust rolling up out of the southwest that turned the last clean light the color of a bruise within the space of 20 minutes. Clara had just enough warning to lash the canvas shelter down tight against the lead wagon and to drag the strongbox in under cover with her when the wind hit in full, howling low across the open crust and driving fine salt dust through every seam of her shelter until she could taste it on her teeth. She had wrapped herself in her coat and pressed into the angle of the wagon box when she heard, faint under the wind, a voice calling, and she went out into the storm without thinking twice, because a voice on the Coldwater Flats in a night like that one meant a person in trouble and nothing else. She found him 40 yards out, stumbling, a young rider no older than herself, his horse gone lame beneath him somewhere back along the eastern approach and left behind in the dark, his canteen dry and his direction entirely lost in the blowing salt. He was, she would learn once she had gotten him back to the shelter of the wagons and poured what water she could spare down his throat, a rider named Silas Ombry, 19 years old, sent out by Garrett Pratt himself earlier that evening, with instructions Silas would only describe, shame-faced, as intended to frighten her off the flats before her business could be finished. Instructions he had never meant to carry out and had abandoned the moment the storm caught him exposed on open ground. Clara did not turn him away for what he had been sent to do. She got him inside the canvas shelter, out of the worst of the wind, and she sat with him through the long hours of the storm, sharing what little water remained between them, and by the time the wind finally dropped toward dawn, Silas Ombry had told her everything he knew of what Garrett Pratt feared she might find. which was not so very different from what she had already read in Lieutenant Ashworth's own hand. They walked out together in the gray light of morning, Silas leaning on her shoulder the last mile until they struck the eastern trail, and a search party sent out at first, light by his own worried mother, found them both and carried them the rest of the way to Broken Water. Clara did not rest there. Within the day she had arranged passage north, with the strongbox wrapped in oiled canvas and lashed behind her on a borrowed mule, and she rode the 80 miles to the territorial garrison at Fort Laramore herself, rather than trust the ledger to any hand but her own. And there she laid the whole of it. Ledger, letters, and commission paper, before a lean, careful colonel named Everett Marsh, who read every page twice without speaking, and then looked up at her and said quietly that the army had carried 6 names on its rolls as lost and unaccounted for a very great deal longer than any family should have to bear such uncertainty, and that she had just closed a file that had sat open, unresolved, for 17 years. The inquiry that followed moved faster than Clara had any reason to expect. 2 deputies rode south within the week, and a formal survey party followed within the month, and the wagons were opened at last under proper army authority, their seals broken not by looters, but by the very institution that had sealed them. And the payroll and ordnance within, though tarnished and long overdue in every ledger in the territory, were recovered whole and accounted for at last. Garrett Pratt was called before an inquiry of his own regarding his father's conduct and his own attempt to frighten a claimant off federal ground, and though the worst of his father's sins could not be laid at his feet, the range boundary he had guarded so fiercely for so many years was quietly redrawn, and the county recorder's office, at Colonel Marsh's own recommendation, confirmed Clara Whitfield's claim on the section of flat, touching the old Convoy road, as clean, clear, and fully hers. Word of it traveled through Broken Water, the way water finds every low place in a floor. Simeon Roth, the land clerk who had taken her $11 with such careful pity, came out to the flats himself once the survey was done, and stood a long while looking at the 6 wagons, empty now and being readied for transport back to the fort, and told her plainly that he had thought he was watching a foolish girl throw away her last coin on a joke, and that he had never in his life been more glad to be wrong about a person. The 2 men who had laughed at her by the stove came separately, weeks apart, to say much the same thing in fewer words, and did not laugh again. Obadiah Kest, when the news reached Laramore Crossing, sent word by the first rider heading south that he had known Walter Whitfield's girl would either come to nothing or come to something the whole territory would remember, and that he had never once doubted which it would be, and Clara kept that letter folded inside the cover of the very ledger that had told her the truth of her father's worst week. Silas Ombry came back to the flats more than once in the months that followed. First to help her haul lumber for a proper cabin at the edge of her claim, where the ground firmed up enough to build on. And later, simply because he had grown fond of the company and did not pretend otherwise, and Clara found she did not mind the company either, though she was careful, in the way her father had raised her to be careful, not to build her whole life around a debt of gratitude mistaken for something else. The army, in recognition of the ledger's return and the resolution of a case 17 years cold, granted her a modest reward from the recovered payroll, enough to see the cabin roofed properly before the first hard winter, and to send 3 plain stones to a small churchyard in Laramore Crossing, where her mother had been buried without one, and her father beside her at last, with his name cut clean and his years counted honestly. On an evening in late autumn, with the light going long and gold across the flats, and the 6 empty wagons gone north at last to whatever record the army meant to keep of them, Clara Whitfield sat on the step of her half-finished cabin, with the brass buckle warm in her palm, turned over and over the way her father used to turn it by a low fire on 100 quiet nights she had not understood until now. She thought of Obadiah's patient dominoes and his stool by the stove. She thought of Lieutenant Thomas Ashworth's careful, unfinished handwriting, and of the letters his own family had written for 17 years into a silence that finally, at long last, had an answer. She thought of her father walking out alone across 40 miles of open salt because someone had to try, and surviving it, and carrying the weight of the men he could not save for the rest of his quiet life, without ever once setting the weight down in words she could understand until it was nearly too late. She had come out onto the flats with $11 and a belt buckle, and nothing else in the world to lose, and the ground that everyone in Broken Water had called worthless had kept, faithfully and exactly, everything her father had left unfinished, waiting 17 years for someone with the patience to ask the right questions of it. It was, she thought, watching the last light run gold across the white crust toward a horizon that no longer seemed empty to her at all. The best $11 anyone had ever spent. If you've stayed with Clara all the way out onto the flats and back, take a moment now to like this video and subscribe so the next story finds you when it's ready. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from tonight, and tell us, if you're willing, about the person in your own life who carried a weight for years without ever quite setting it down in words you understood until it was almost too late. Ask yourself, before you close this out, what ground in your own life everyone else has called worthless that might simply be waiting, patient and sealed, for someone willing to walk out and ask it the right questions. Until next time, stay close.